This is National 5, Unit 3, Key Area 5, Food Production. The human population is increasing, and this requires a greater yield of food to feed everybody. Food yield means how much food is produced. Humans have got some strategies to try and increase food yield, including using fertilisers and pesticides. Fertilisers are chemicals which allow you to provide enough nutrients for more plants to grow in the same area of land. And pesticides are chemicals which kill pests like insects or fungus, which can damage your plants and reduce the yield. This next bit looks at a flowchart of how fertilisers work. The most important ingredient of a fertiliser is nitrates. Nitrates are essential for plant growth. The nitrates are taken up by the plant when it takes up water from the soil. The plants use the nitrates to make amino acids, or one of the ingredients for their amino acids, which of course are the building blocks of proteins. When animals consume plants and other animals which have eaten plants, they also obtain proteins. Here's a simple diagram showing that. So rain falls, nitrates are dissolved in the soil, water taken up by the roots of the plant includes nitrates. Nitrates are used to make amino acids. Amino acids are made into proteins, and then when animals eat plants or other animals, they get proteins from that. As with everything, you've got a solution, it can bring problems with it. The problem with the fertilisers is that they can damage the environment. This section is quite an important section that you might need to be able to describe in full in an exam, so make sure you know the order of what happens. The problem with fertilisers is that they can lead to something called an algal bloom. You might have seen an algal bloom if you've ever seen a bit of stagnant water that's not moving, so maybe a bit of a pond, where it looks all green on the top, as if there's green stuff floating all over it. That's an algal bloom. Algal blooms are damaging. We'll see why in this list below. First of all, the fertilisers that we're spraying onto crops can leach out into the fresh water of rivers, lochs and ponds. So when it rains, the fertilisers are washed into all the areas of fresh water. And what this does is it puts unnecessary and unwanted nitrates into the water. This leads to the algae growing rapidly and causing an algal bloom. So you can actually see the pond looking green. Algal blooms reduce the light levels because the algae is sitting on top of the water and it stops the light getting down to the plants underneath. And those plants then die because they can't do photosynthesis. And the algae then die due to competition because they're all growing so rapidly, they're competing with each other. All these dead plants and dead algae then become food for bacteria, and the bacteria numbers massively increase. Once your bacteria are multiplying, they're using up all the oxygen, so there's less oxygen for other organisms living in the water, and they die. So freshwater fish and other animals that live in there are wiped out, and you end up with very little biodiversity in there. Now, we do have alternatives for fertilisers. In Unit 1, we learned a section about genetic engineering. In genetic engineering, we learned the example of taking the human gene for insulin, putting it into a bacterial plasmid, and getting bacteria to manufacture insulin that humans can use. Those genetically altered bacteria that can make insulin are called genetically modified bacteria. We can use this concept of genetic engineering to make genetically modified crops which can have better qualities and avoid the need for fertilisers as well. What you do is you take DNA from one species and incorporate it into another species. So one example might be making plants which can grow with fewer nutrients. So that would cut down your use of fertilisers. Other things you can do is make plants that grow bigger to give a bigger yield. And one example is the flavour saver tomato, which has been genetically modified to have just as nice a flavour as one that's been freshly picked, even though it's been in a supermarket for a long time. So genetically modified crops can be an alternative to fertilisers. Let's look now at some of the problems with pesticides, looking at an example food chain here. Pesticides are chemicals that are used to kill pest species to protect your crops. So let's look at this example over here. We've got some pesticide in the water that's got into the algae. So the pesticide has washed off the crops, come into the water, and the algae have taken it up. Now, when the mayfly nymphs eat algae, they don't just eat one, do they? They eat several algae, and every single bit of algae had some pesticide in it. So all the pesticide that is in all the algae goes into the mayfly nymph. Then when the sunfish eats some mayfly nymphs, it eats a few of them. So it's getting all that chemical concentrated into its body. And by the time we get to this top predator here, the blue heron, our levels of pesticide are getting to dangerous levels because every bit of pesticide that's been eaten in the previous parts of the food chain or taken in by the plants at the start all gets accumulated into the body of the top predator. This is called bio-accumulation, where the pesticides are built up to dangerous levels. And there's an example down here of DDT. DDT was a widely used insecticide. It was even hoped to be going to wipe out all the mosquitoes which spread malaria. But the problem with DDT is that it was passing up the food chain, going from insects to small birds, and then from small birds to birds of prey like hawks. And the very high levels of DDT in the hawks was affecting their eggs, and the eggs weren't hatching. So DDT was going to lead to potentially some species dying out, and it got banned. Here's some alternatives for pesticides for the last section. Again, you could do genetically modified crops. Some plants have defences to stop animals and insects from eating them. If you could take the genes from those plants that code for whether it's bitter chemicals that stop them being eaten or other properties, you could take that gene and put it into your crop plants and make them unpalatable to pesticides. My favourite use of an alternative to pesticides is biological control. Here you take a natural predator, and the usual example, we can see a picture of it over here. Aphids or green fly damage plants. What you can do is bring in their natural predators, ladybirds, and the ladybirds will eat the green fly and therefore keep your crop from getting damaged.